You tell me that you love me. 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 Tell me that you love me. You tell me that you love me. You tell me that you love me. You tell me that you love me.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, those online, those in our audience. Welcome to Panama and welcome to Latin America and the Climate Week 2023. This session is entitled Transforming Lives, Discovering the Differentiated Impacts of Climate Change and Finding Inclusive Solutions for Equality. Dear colleagues and friends, thank you so much for joining us for this session. My name is Travis Sinkler. I am from the government of Barbados. Happy to be in Panama again. And I work with the Ministry of the Environment, National Beautification, Blue and Green Economy. I am honored to be your moderator for this event. First and foremost, I would like to inform you that simultaneous interpretation for this event is available in Spanish. To make use of this service, kindly grab an interpretation device. If you haven't already done so, just hold 1 second. So not here either. Okay. Okay. All right. You can scan the QR code provided. You are required to use your own phones and headsets. Climate change influences human development through its impact on livelihood systems. The actual climate crisis exacerbates existing structural inequalities and triggers a chain reaction of socioeconomic consequences for specific groups, including children and youth, women, and local communities, indigenous peoples, Afro descendants, and displaced populations, among others. For all these groups, displacement may be either an unwanted consequence or, on the other hand, an adaptation strategy in response to these disproportionate burdens. In the context of the Latin American and Caribbean region, understanding and addressing the differentiated impacts of climate change on these specific groups is critical. Failing to do so can perpetuate and even exacerbate existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. The main aim for this session is to provide a space to reflect on the differentiated impacts of climate change, recognize the knowledge from different groups, and share experiences and good practices from this perspective of the local communities and groups more affected by climate change. This event is co-organized by Save the Children, United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environment Program, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UN Women, and the World Bank. Special thanks to go to the Panamanian government for hosting us today. I would also like to thank you all for being part of this session, and we look forward to your active participation. Colleagues and friends, it is now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Jocelyn. She is 17 years old. She was born in the southern mountains of Peru. She's studying in high school. At the age of 8, she began her activism as a defender of the rights of working children and adolescents in the national movement of organized children and adolescents of Peru, which is part of the Latin America and Caribbean movement of working children and adolescents. In her regional role, Jocelyn has represented the organization in spaces of strategic and political dialogue on children's rights, and they're linked with the environment and climate at the national and regional level, emphasizing the importance of participation of children and adolescents in an environment agenda. So please join me in welcoming her. Jocelyn, you have the floor.
Muy buenos días.
Morning. I want to begin by mentioning that children already know that we are in a climate emergency where our lives, animals, and our Mother Earth is in danger and is at risk. We cannot talk about a future where currently there are many children whose rights have been vulnerable, their lives. The we children are the most affected, and our our animals are dying, our crops as well. And therefore it is time to talk about the challenges that we are facing. Once again, children are raising our voices. Voices that need to be heard. We demand a world that should be more human, dignified for everybody, so that natural resources should prevail for future generations, for future lives that unfortunately are already being affected. And we find ourselves today unable to enjoy drinking and clean water, clean air, healthy environment, a green environment. We are we are the caretakers of our rivers, of our fields. We are sowing, and above all, from the movement, Latin American movement, where I am representative of, the working children, working out in the field unites us with our community. They teach us about nature, respect that Mother Nature deserves. This is a formation, this is a space of formation, and it gives a lot of way for development for our peers and the children who organize. Children and adolescents also say that we cannot prioritize economic interest above our Mother Earth. We want an intercultural education where our languages should not be discriminated, where children cannot be vulnerated in these aspects. So, above all, we say yes to life and yes to nature because whatever does good to children and nature will be good for humanity. States need to comply with reports such as the Generational Report 26. This is a tool not just to mitigate, but also to be here present with the climate crisis, but also to put a stop and look beyond the interest in order to prioritize, to stop the companies that are contaminating, because our world cannot be affected in this manner. Childhood is already tired of seeing that unfortunately our voices are made invisible. We need to promote spaces of participation, spaces where we can be heard. And it's not just for a mere picture. Children and adolescents like me and my peers throughout the organization process, we have been able to know and we have able to show that another world is possible. A world where children and adolescents, along with human beings, as well as animals and plants, have rights. We want to enjoy those rights, and at the same time, we want you to understand that climate crisis can affect a generation that is still not present. Today, I'm going to talk about my language, which is Quechua. Some of the words that reflect what we feel. Taita Inti, Papamamanta, Waira, Yaku, Uiwakuna, Warmakuna, Rimas Haiki, Wawankuta, Ujari, which in Spanish is the Father, Son, the Mother Earth, air, water, animals, and children are talking to you. Listen to the children and awaken. We cannot stop. We need to take action along with children. Nobody can be removed of these spaces where truly their voices matter and have a lot to give input to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I hope you'll stay with us. We are excited to participate in this very important and timely event, and we look forward to fruitful discussions and your active participation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to move to the first panel, discussion on climate change impacts on people's livelihoods. First, I would like to introduce our wonderful panel. We have Tabia Kasik, who's online. She's an Indigenous leader and member of the, I'm going to try with this, Ashanika people of the province of Atalaya Ucayali region. I hope I got that right. Since she was young, she has been involved in serving her people from her role as a leader and also from her profession as a nurse technician. Currently, she is a member of the board of directors of the Interethnic Association for the Development of the Peruvian Jungle and leads the Health and Forest and Climate Program. We also have with us here, present in the room, Priyanka Laila. She's 17 years old. She's a student from Trinidad and Tobago from my region. UNICEF Youth Advocate since 2020, the National Child's Rights Ambassador since 2018, the chair of the Child's Rights Steering Committee and author of the first in a series of children's books entitled Svara Ocean Adventures, it's 2022, and the Zero Waste Lifestyle. Lunch kit recognized by Forbes magazine, along with the work she did in Argentina to legislate the new child's rights to the environment. And then we have Luis, also online. Luis Gamara, a program specialist in disaster risk reduction and recovery at UNDP. Luis has over 20 years of experience in resilience building, disaster risk reduction and recovery, working with UNDP and other development agencies in Latin America and the Asia Pacific region. His experience has focused on the generation of mechanisms, instruments, and institutional coordination for disaster risk governance with emphasis on urban areas. I would like to start by asking Tabia, how are Indigenous groups, and especially Indigenous women, impacted by climate change? And why are the contributions of Indigenous women important in the fight against climate change? And just to add to that, what is your personal perspective as an Indigenous woman from the Amazon? Tabia, you have the floor.
Pasón que maweni, no huero tabea cacique, no poña Perú. Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tabea Cacique. I am Peruvian in representation of the interethnic development of the Peruvian jungle. And so I would like to take this space in order to show everybody how Indigenous women are fighting climate change, because this is something that's been felt even in the Indigenous communities, and how women are also uh, contributing to the mitigation of climate change. And so, as Indigenous and Amazon women, we are combating effects of climate change that are affecting global level, worldwide, and also it is not an isolated case towards indigenous communities. From the communities, we have been working in our territories on a strategic governance from our own knowledge of indigenous communities, the input of women as those who have self knowledge towards the protection, conservation, preservation of resources that are existing in our territories. Many times we are made invisible on the participation and input that we or contributions that we make as women. It was evidenced from the pandemic that when sisters of the community confronted this disease that we didn't know, because we did not know what was the treatment, but from our knowledge, we helped our population, our community, in order to face the situation and save our families and our entire communities. Who did that work? Women. We using the resources of the forest, medicine plants that provided medicine, and so from there we valued very much the knowledge that our youth was not taking into consideration, but currently we are rescuing our self knowledge and valuing it even more, giving it a lot of value. And therefore, from our community, we have been working jointly in relation to helping our children know the importance of the resources that are offered to us and how to protect them in order to use it in relation to be able to create fabrics. We have our own resources in order to spin. And so these resources are provided by nature, they're provided by our forest. All of this knowledge, spirituality, the management of medicine plants, family economy, that we contribute in our homes, guaranteeing food security, guaranteeing the security of the seeds themselves, guaranteeing this ancestral knowledge that we have been fostering every year. And so it is important that we support each other in the management of governance in our territory. While it is true that our brothers, our family, our children, our husbands, we support as women in terms of vigilance. In terms of vigilance, who accompanies their husbands in order to do the works in the field, well, women also accompany their husbands, taking food, accompanying them every day, being with them every single day in order to walk all of those areas. And many times they're not made visible, they're not even expressed in different spaces. But that work is also the contribution of women. And also in our community, we help so that these resources should not disappear. This resource that the forest provides her, this relation that we have with nature is extremely important and it is valuable. It has to it has a lot to do with the cosmovision that indigenous communities have. And for our territory, that is everything. It is life, it is our home, because this is where we were born and this is where we're going to die. I heard the participation of Miss Jocelyn, and it is time that we should welcome our youth, our children in environmental issues, conservation issues, make the youth aware ever since they're very young. I have my experience that when my daughter would come out of school and being in elementary school, they had she was made aware that she shouldn't misuse water, that drop by drop, every drop that comes out of the wash basin, you are misusing water. And so we need to make sure that this awareness that the school gave her, she would practice it at home, and she was helping, because every drop that a faucet lets go, it's going to waste. And so this is the importance of children, and the work is of everybody in order to protect Mother Earth and nature. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Tabia. I'd like to, Priyanka, I'd like to invite you to answer this question. Amongst all groups, youth is the most vocal when advocating for climate change. Why is this, and how is climate change affecting children and youth? Priyanka, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. It's great to be on a panel with such enthusiastic and passionate young women. And thank you for including this topic in our session today. I think the reason why young people and children in our region are so passionate and driven towards fighting for this climate crisis and motivated to do so is because we understand kind of automatically that our generation has that responsibility to ensure the security, the peace, and the justice, as well as the sustainability of our region and our world. And I think through the support of UNICEF and its partners, the encouragement and the support has given young people the voice and the platforms in order to do so and manifest their dreams, manifest their potentials and their ideas into reality. And we need to continue to do so. Especially in the Caribbean region and Latin America, we are uniquely affected by the climate crisis. And in Trinidad and Tobago, as a small island developing state, I've seen firsthand the impact of the climate crisis on our people, especially in marginalized communities, in coastal communities, and the impact this has on an annual basis, especially with things like, for example, flash flooding or unprecedented rainfall. You see those coastal and informal communities and lower socioeconomic households hit on an annual basis. And you see the devastation within their crops, their farms, their properties, their personal belongings, their basic human rights. And you see the impact this has on children and the infringement on their rights, the right to go to school, the right to education, their safety, their protection, their sanity, their hygiene. And it's a constant cycle, but the people who are most affected on this annual basis don't see the correlation between what's actually happening and the fact that it is climate change. So it highlights the knowledge gap and the fact that many people in the Caribbean region still see climate change as a scientific process, not as a climate crisis or code red for humanity or an infringement on their human rights. So because there is that knowledge gap, there is a huge disconnect between the information that our policymakers and leaders in society have compared to those who are affected and who need that information in order to develop and ensure that they are not faced by the destruction and devastation on an annual basis. And it's integrated in every part of their lives. So it's not only looking at how it's destroyed on a physical status, but also the quality of their water, the loss of assets, the loss of property and their water supply, the loss of family, the loss of dignity. And they're pushed back further into poverty. The fishermen, the farmers, the agriculture, the women and children, the girls, and the role that they play in reimagining how we move forward. But there's a disconnect between this and how they can achieve that. So I think young people and children are passionate about, advocating for this because we are feeling the effects of it, especially in the region, and we see firsthand what is happening. And we need to take urgent action because we see it as a responsibility. The climate crisis is an injustice and it's an infringement on our rights, and we have the right to an environment. And in order to achieve this and achieve an equitable future, we need to put in the work and we need to call on our leaders. And I think this is the role of the young people. And so far, I've seen amazing progress through the work of UNICEF and its support of young people, and we need to continue to do so. And I think also just in order to support our small island developing states and especially our Caribbean region, it needs to be specific to our unique circumstances. So green skills, educating our women and girls, empowerment, collecting and sharing information that is specific to our region and specific to the ways that they would interpret this information, teaching farmers and fishermen how they can inherit sustainable practices, simple practices like this that would change the way that we move towards sustainability and that are relevant to our region and how we plan to progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Louise, we turn to you and I have two questions. How is climate change and related disasters impacting people's well-being? And can you share with us the outcome of the post-disaster needs assessment? Louise, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I will switch back to Spanish. And so,
I'm going to concentrate mainly in results of the last years, assessments of situations because of disasters. The governments have been affected, and the agencies of the United Nations systems. To recognize in our region, we are the most impacted region. 75% of all disasters worldwide happen in a region, and 9 out of 10 people affected by these disasters are related to climate events, and this is increasing. Climate change, we have heard about this in the past days with a lot of emphasis, and there are some processes of the temperature increase periods, intensification of heat, intensification and appearance of increasing frequency of appearing of El Niño and La Niña. In Mexico, these are a clear example of this impact. When these events happen, obviously the economy is also affected, mainly people's wellness. And these are examples that we have seen by the previous presenters on this table, and how life conditions are affected, how sustenance bases are destroyed, productive activities, access to services, how is also their food security compromised. As a result, poverty can become embedded, and this is what's happening. Inequality may increase considerably because we just don't have the same level of access to resources and services, and progress of human development can also be affected. And even though economic losses suffered by poverty level households, when you do a macroeconomic analysis, the impact on these households is usually very high and higher in other socioeconomic strata, and it is concentrated in sectors of most vulnerable populations. They are more exposed to the threats and present higher vulnerability in their economic activities and access to services. And this impact could be prolonged during a very long time, usually longer than what a recovery or reconstruction process could last when you're recovering physical infrastructure, for example. So when we see this impact on people, we have to think in the mid or long-term impact of these people. And COVID showed this clearly, for example. And this affects mainly the sustenance of the household and other members, and access that they could suffer because of this decrease of the access to their livelihood, and also access to services like education, health, and evidently to people's quality of life. And this affects also some family members more than others. The population of elder adults or children, people with disabilities, women, because vulnerability conditions are also different. It is also very important to recognize the complex character and ever more complex, we call these composed disasters or blended disasters. And COVID is a great example in which we have cross references of other kinds of crises like the COVID, but social, political, discriminatory issues, other types of disasters, not necessarily the event of an earthquake, but also climate conditions. In the last years, for example, with the hurricanes that invaded El Salvador, and in Belize with the phenomenon of La Nina, and flooding in Colombia, we have seen an affectation to life conditions and to livelihood conditions that were affected basically first because of COVID, and then when there was a slight recovery, the recovery wasn't balanced or equitable in all across all states or social strata. And on top of that, climate events affect this situation, and we have a full circle of affectations in the recovery process, in the development process, makes it more difficult for this particular population. In that sense, we are pushing in the assessments of post-disaster recovery. We have to include an human analysis, human impact analysis. And as I mentioned, it goes beyond that short midterm of recovery, of rebuild of infrastructure. We also have to measure how these effects can affect 5 clear aspects: life conditions of population, access to housing, safe housing, health, education, which is reflected in the multidimensional poverty level indexes that combine all of these factors. Also, the livelihood means it's measured access to people. We'll delve more into that. I'm talking about income and resources, but also a third aspect, food security. Access to safe food, also gender equality in every aspect, so that we can find these differences in access to resources and decision making. And these indices are measured in this assessment of needs of post-disaster recovery to measure the human impact. There are some elements that we have to go deeper, and I want to mention what Bianca said, the equity issue, equality issue, that we're also talking about mental health in its psychosocial aspects, and we need to assess the impact of what is this having, because this also provides a sense of security and safety to families when you have these type of issues. And to concentrate on the topic of livelihood, which helps us to measure how the poverty line varies and how those sectors of the population after a disaster could be led to extreme poverty. Access to subsistence means as a result of the result, which was the previous situation, for example, pre-COVID, how they were being affected, what were the inequality levels, and then how this was all affected for every type of occupation, trade, business, tourism, industry, and how there is a loss of income because of the disaster, unemployment, business losses, micro companies, micro businesses, which was 93% of all the productive force. And we have to take into consideration business closing because of this disaster. And also a third aspect, assets and productive resources. How do you have access to credit, to savings when you have productive assets? These are part of the households and the affected houses. We're talking also even business infrastructures, tools. All of this is input for an analysis of the poverty level. There are some examples in the region. Peru, for example, 2003 and 2008, because of disasters, poverty increased from 16 to 23%. Bangladesh, 41 to 63%. And there are many different examples. And something that is really important to include in these studies is the social and economic dynamics of the informal sector. And this is very important because we're talking about tasks such as domestic work, business activities surrounding schools, like street vendors or the taxi driver, the messengers, how all of this is affected for affecting the household economies. In the end, we have to think of formulation of policies towards recovery measures that don't exacerbate inequality. And these have to be fast so that we can provide cash to affected families, for example, because they lost their livelihood while they are recovering their households, their businesses, their community, and then to reactivate the local economy. By activating the local economy, for example, through trade, local business, instead of bringing resources from outside the community, you take advantage of the agricultural goods from the community, for example, and this helps kickstart the economy of the whole sector. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Louise. We will now move this at this time to the question and answer section. I have Tracy with me, who will be monitoring online. And I want to open the floor to you here in the audience and on those online. Do we have any questions, contributions, observations? Anyone online? Oh. Okay, please, just hold 1 second. Go right ahead, please. We have Joyce.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm very curious and I want to, well, I think I'm gonna ask in español. Muchísimas gracias, señor Luis, por ese análisis. Me gustaría preguntar, tal vez.
I'll speak in Spanish. Thank you, Luis. If you can make some suggestions of documents where you can find data that you just shared, because we've been talking a lot during this session. We as young people, when we have different governments, when we can find concrete information that helps us validate, for example, now that we're on the way to the COPs. Which are the references that we can take into account when we talk to the policymakers, and also for the other representatives, what sort of reading you can leave us to comprehend not only your cosmovision, but also the work that you do. Thank you.
So we have a question to Louise regarding the information, how you can source that type of information. Louise, any perspective? And also in terms of the connection as young persons, as they become advocates. So I'll hold that. We have one more question. Louise, just give us a second. There's another question as well. Okay, go ahead, Louise.
Sí. Sí. Creo que María tenía una mano levantada, pero...
I think Maria still had her hand raised. But anyways, thank you, Joyce, for the query. I will write in the chat some resource links so that you can access to this information. These are usual analysis done hand in hand with the government. And you can find that also in the web pages of the national entities listed there, especially during the last year. There were studies done in El Salvador in a composed way, such as COVID and the couple of hurricanes that affected the country. Belize also, and Colombia along the same line, also as Peru, to get this input. And I will write it in the chat. And also, I have been I am excited by the words of all this comprehensive way, how climate change and disasters are affecting our communities. And this should be a call to action facing these issues.
Maria, you have the floor.
Are you listening?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yo soy María de Lourdes de São Paulo, Universidad de São Paulo, Facultad de Medicina.
I'm Maria Lourdes from Sao Paulo. I've been working for 25 years with Indian villages in Mato Grosso do Sur. There's a lot of soy and all indigenous peoples reservations are the interpreter apologizes. These ladies speaking in Portuguese. Okay, back to Spanish. Young people are not fully aware of what's going on. The problems are in policies. We have a lot of policies. We all have. I believe the big problem is the implementation. There's no true implementation. There's no education. Young people and children because there is a lack of rain. Local plantations are not being produced anymore, and there are things that are not being implemented. The problem is, again, how to implement the plans. That's my big question. I do work. I am a medical anthropologist. I try to implement, but I cannot follow through. It's impossible to work by yourself. That's my big concern. Thank you.
I would like to, Priyanka, I don't know if you want to respond to that, please. This is in the issue that Maria raised is an implementation deficit. We could talk about education and on all these things, but that is where the action is required. So just you want to share any perspectives on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Maria, for your response. I think specifically in regards to small island developing states and in our region, there is another gap in regards to the policies and the laws that are implemented and created compared to the actual implementation and how it impacts the communities and the people who need it the most. Because ultimately, we can have as many policies or as many jargons or as many laws that sound great, but if they're not actually implemented and not actually benefiting the groups who need them the most, it is meaningless. So I think definitely a call to our leaders and a call to our policymakers is to close that gap and ensure that there is accountability and transparency in everything that we do. And I think that definitely to achieve this, we need to look at our unique circumstances and find ways that our unique countries, our unique communities and our region can collaborate and cooperate to ensure our peace, our security, and our justice, and ensure that the policies that we create are actually implemented and reach those communities, those informal communities, those marginalized groups who need them the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I believe we have a question from the audience. Okay, please, go ahead. And you can introduce yourself.
Hola, sí.
Yes.
Buenos días a todos, muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Enaida Laudo Rodríguez, yo soy de la Resama.
My name is Zenaida Rodriguez. My question is for Jocelyn. If you can listen to me. First of all, I am very happy. I am also from Peru, from the South Andean. It's very nice to see these young people coming out of those remote places. What challenges have you found with other young children, young men and women that mobilize from those regions, which are isolated from this debate, and society is indifferent to this topic? So maybe this topic, they don't think that it's there, it's affecting them directly. And what are the challenges that you have found, the problems you have found, and that you think us, the adults, what can we do to strengthen the efforts you are doing as boys, girls, and adolescents? What's the message you can give us so that we can contribute with this fight that you are carrying from this space that you have? Thank you.
Jocelyn? We have Jocelyn with us? Okay. All right, well, we'll hold that question just in case she comes back, but thank you for that. I really want to thank the panelists, and I want to issue a challenge to Louise. There will be a Latin American Climate Week 2024. You have interest here, Priyanka, Jocelyn. You are doing a lot. You spoke about the issue of the poverty index. You hear some of the needs, some of the challenges. And perhaps there's an opportunity for you, Louise, to look at some type of compact, look at the issues here, reach out, have an engagement. You have an institutional platform, and to see, you've heard some recommendations, and where you operate, you need information. You're at a very high level. You recognize the local input that is critical, the rebuilding local economies from a post-disaster standpoint. So you have those local actors here, and you see some specific issues even raised by our member of our audience. So I want to challenge you in 1 year, come back, engage them, and to see if we can build something here, specifically youth and marginalized persons through your platform. You don't have to respond unless you want to commit right now, but I'll leave that with you. Over.
Con mucho gusto, con mucho gusto.
With pleasure, and I take this challenge, and we take this challenge as an organization as well. This analysis of human impact, given even if these are consolidated numbers and percentages as to how these levels of poverty and access are affected, truly this is based on information and cases such as those that you have shown off, and thoughts and feelings that have been exposed by local stakeholders. And so I do take up the challenge in order to do this as well, and to make this more visible and to be able to incorporate to these platforms the analysis of the situation post disaster. As it has been mentioned, it is usually concentrated in the affectation of the infrastructure, how the macroeconomy can be affected in the country, but really it is these particular cases that we need to tend to in order to avoid the extreme poverty, or to in order to avoid increasing poverty and inequality in these cases. Thank you so much.
Maria, do we have a question from Maria or a comment, please? Go ahead, Maria.
I will speak in Spanish than in English. I think they understand better.
This is your interpreter. Portuguese has been spoken at this time.
Gracias.
Thank you, Maria. And all I can say, and we in the room, Luis, go ahead.
Sí, gracias. Y a los dos intervenciones de María.
Yes, thank you. And to both Maria's interventions, as I do coincide or agree with her position and the challenges that have been confronted in order to bring forward the topics that have been pushed. And speaking and listening to Jocelyn Matavea Villanca, and their position and the organizations to which they present, you can see a light of hope and the motivating words and the call to action that they are doing that definitely reflect. There are people such as yourselves, Maria, who are pushing this as well. Maybe we don't know it, who are not linked to our closest circle, but the generation of alliances and these spaces can help us know other people who are pushing change like us. And these alliances can be useful to elevate the voice and in some way or another achieve greater political awareness in the decision for the decision makers. And I think the alliances between those organizations who are pushing this topic with the support of other institutions is key.
Intervenir. Hola. Quería participar en relación a complementar el aporte.
I want to participate in relation to complementing this contribution. In terms of the question, the indigenous movement, this word, climate change, is imposed. It is a word in our language as an indigenous community, does not exist. I hope the activities and actions that we know from our own expertise, but this topic to approach and explain in our self language many times does not exist. So, what we do here to be so that the indigenous community understands, amongst others, and other inter and other generational issues is another topic. So the message that I want to say is usually translated from our perspective with examples, and it is very complex. And as I mentioned, the actions and activities that we do are just the same as talking about climate change currently. So I think here we need to differentiate. How do we understand this as indigenous communities? How does the Western world understand this?
Floor, we have a question from the audience. Did you?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Sí,
Yes, thank you so much. A question was asked regarding the challenges do children and adolescents, workers, and young children in general confront in Peru. So, since I am representing the space of organized working youth and children, and along with this, other entities are also present. But one of the challenges for us is that the spaces are limited. For example, workshops and other things that are happening only for people who are in the cities. Many times it does not reach those zones where children end up without a voice. They do not take into consideration the voices where things are actually happening. And also, another issue is how they see us, because believe me, children and youth, adolescents, they feel that they're not able to see their own social context or participate into this. Just because we're children, we need to dedicate to play and study, but our reality is different. As adolescent, I have been working since I was very young. I study, I work, and I like what I do. I also participate in these spaces in order to precisely take the voice of my peers up front. And another challenge here, for example, in Peru, is that they are adult centric. This is a reality in other countries as well, not just in my country. Children and adolescents are not taken into account in spaces where decisions are taken, especially where they speak about us. And I have an experience where we participated with the Ministry of Women. We presented all of the proposals we had based on a law that they wanted to enact. And yes, we were heard, but we were not taken into consideration. And again, this reflected that we are being used merely for a picture, as I said before. And this space does not reach out where it should, where decisions are taken, where they should take us into consideration. And so, another struggle that we have as a Latin American movement in my country and everywhere where children and adolescents are defending their rights, we see that we are limited in terms of freedom of expression. We cannot take place, or we cannot take part in protests and marchings. But this is something very common for us, and importantly, because we do this with our communities, with our family members, friends, and our peers, and above all, because it is to support a cause. And the other thing I would like to mention is that within these spaces today, for example, protesting or raising your voice is like you are risking your life, because our own authorities, or the police officers in this case, if you are a child, I'm not going to harm you. If you are an adolescent, I'm not going to harm you. And so based on this, some of the people in our organization passed away. And along with him, many other young children and adults passed away supposedly because they were have to have this right, and they were not allowed. And we need to understand that yes, we are being limited to many things instead of opening our spaces, and to understand our realities. We are deprived of our rights. Children and adolescents are not just in certain zones. Lima are not regions. I am of a region. I am an Andean adolescent who comes from the mountains of Peru, and I have realized that if a person does not manage to identify these type of things, they are not going to achieve a change. And as 35 years in the organization, fighting above all from deaths that have been as a result of the protests and being on the streets, we are tired of all of this. And I also feel that the limitations that with which we are confronting are not going to stop. That is true. But we want it to stop now. And we want us to be truly heard and allow us to participate. And it shouldn't end up as an empty space. Truly listen to us. Thank you.
We're going to move on to the next panel, but what I would like to, again, Louisa and Tracy and others here, we've heard a number of observations, we've heard some recommendations, we've heard the challenges. While climate change has brought us into this space, these are broader development issues. And to the extent in this space, certainly for next year, I spoke to Louise, I think there's always a solution to these challenges. They may not occur in the timeframes that we'd like, but we have to keep pressing, and communication is key. So at a minimum, creating communication platforms like this, again, in LAC Week, and what can be done in the interim. The other point, there's a parallel meeting, the Forum of Ministers of Environment for Latin America and the Caribbean. We're all Latin American and Caribbean countries sit. Trinidad was here, Peru, and there was a push again to regarding indigenous persons, how they could play a more fundamental role. We heard from the youth delegates, the extent to which those youth delegates are working at all levels. I think that will always need to be enhanced, but there's a platform whereby the youth will play a more fundamental role in bringing policies, bringing policy recommendations, bringing the issues as it relates to the environment in that space. So again, Luis, Tracy, you have some homework, and I think there's opportunity here. So again, I want to thank the panelists, Priyanka, Tabia, Jocelyn, Louise. Thank you. A round of applause, please.
Muchas gracias.
So I'd like to move on to our second panel on livelihoods protection. We have 40 minutes or so, and I'd like to invite our speakers, Robert Muga, Joyce Mendez, and Mabel Zuniga. Mabel, can you join us here, please? Thank you. You have the option if you want to stay, or it's up to you. All right, yeah, you can. For those in the room and those online, the session will focus on concrete examples of inclusive and gender responsive good practices, approaches, and strategies for livelihoods protection. Please join me in welcoming first Dr. Robert Muga. Robert, I hope I have your name correct. He's a specialist in the future of cities, international security, and climate resilience, and is the senior advisor of numerous UN organizations, including UNDP. He is co-founder of the Agape Institute, a think tank focused on citizen, digital, and climate security. He's also co-founder of SecDev, the SecDev Group, a cybersecurity and digital risk firm focused on using data-driven analytics and artificial intelligence to solve complex challenges. We will also hear from Joyce Mendez. Ms. Mendez is a United Nations Secretary General's Youth Climate Change Advisor, and or else known as a member of the YAG. She's a migrant, social entrepreneur, and climate advocate focused on the nexus of water, food, and energy justice. Joyce co-founded several local and regional youth organizations, including the Moima Viezer Environmental Education Observatory, the Latin American Observatory of Geopolitics of Energy, and the Binational Youth Collective of the Parana Basin 3 from the Cultivating Good Water Initiative, a recipient of the United Nations Water Best Practice Award in 2015. Joyce continues to be active in Yongo and SDG 7 Youth Constituency and the SDG 7 Youth Constituency. And last but not least, we have in the room Mabel Zuniga. She's a climate change analyst within the Ministry of Panama, Ministry of the Environment in Panama. In her work, she focuses on the development of projects that enable the adequate and efficient management of adaptation in the communities most vulnerable to climate change, and the building of national climate resilience in compliance with the objectives set out in the Paris Agreement within the UNFCCC. She is a national negotiator within that convention on adaptation and loss and damage. But what I would like to do, I'd like to call on Robert first. Robert, my question to you, what approaches can address the risks and responses to climate mobility? Robert, you have the floor.
Many thanks. Bon dia, buenos dias, bonjour, hello. It's really a pleasure to be here, albeit remotely, to speak about this issue of climate mobility hotspots in Latin America. Just by way of quick introduction, I'm working with UNDP alongside a number of organizations to really improve our evidence-based forecasting and foresight to really understand some of these relationships between climate shocks, stresses, and population movements. I'm going to cover 4 themes in this very short presentation. The first being issues around just climate trends and LAC, which I think just to get us refreshed. I know that we're in a conference about climate transformation and change, and this is an opportunity for me just to highlight a few trends that I think are germane to the subject. I then want to talk a little bit about climate mobility, what the latest research says about it, and then, of course, to get to the point, regional and subnational responses. In terms of climate vulnerabilities, I think all of us in this room, and we've heard, I think, with great acuity from the previous panel, that all of us are aware that Latin American Caribbean countries are facing acute and diverse climate vulnerabilities. The World Meteorological Organization and others have documented rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, retreating glaciers, and all of this is contributing to an increasingly unpredictable, but also excessive rainfall, intense flooding and landslides, delayed onset of rainy seasons, and increasing frequency and intensity of droughts. Take the case of annual mean temperature anomalies, which are showing a consistent increase, as you can see in this slide. This is both in terms of sea surface temperatures as well as land temperatures. And we're seeing major anomalies in countries across the region, and particularly in specific regions, whether it's Central and Eastern Mexico, Guatemala and El Salvador, parts of Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, Eastern Amazonia, in Brazil, where I'm based, as well as in Central Chile and Central Argentina. We're also seeing an increasing intensity and duration of droughts. Again, intense heat waves, and we've all felt this acutely this year, are increasingly common. We're seeing unusually dry conditions in many countries, including in parts of Costa Rica, northeastern Mexico, central Chile, central and southern Andes, the Plata Basin down here in South America. And this prolonged heat is contributing to a rising incidence of forest fires, as well as excess mortality and morbidity. And recall that 57% of the world's primary forests are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Changing sea level is also a major concern, a longer burn issue, not least given the high concentration of populations across Latin America and the Caribbean that live in coastal and flood-prone regions. Over 27% of our population lives in coastal areas, of which 6 to 8% are in very, very high risk areas in terms of coastal hazards. These climate-related impacts are having clear socioeconomic implications. including for human health, for safety, for food security, for water access, and energy security. In particular, we have over 15 million smallholder farms spread out across Latin America and the Caribbean, contributing to about 14% of global net agriculture. And the impacts of climate change are already negatively impacting labor and crop productivity. These challenges are also especially pronounced in urban settings, where 82% of us in the region currently reside. We're amongst the most urbanized regions in the world. And extreme hot and cold temperatures are already contributing to premature mortality and excess deaths. And it's not just heat waves, but as I mentioned, the cold snaps that are impacting a number of large countries across the region. The big takeaway here is that climate shocks and stresses are increasing in intensity and frequency, and these are contributing to a host of social and economic impacts. Obviously, some regions are going to be more impacted than others, particularly in agriculturally dependent areas and coastal regions prone to these extremes. We're seeing the effects manifest, and we're feeling it acutely amongst our young population speaking today in these panels, in the urban settings, and especially in marginal peri-urban regions in coastal areas, and affecting populations disproportionately from those coming from socioeconomic marginalized areas and geographic and spatial areas most at risk. All of these factors are having implications for people's decisions to stay in place or whether they're going to move to safer ground. And there's growing interest and attention to the issue of climate change, the relationships between climate change and migration, what we're referring to right now as climate mobility. The extent of research and publications, as you can see here, has grown considerably since the 1970s, particularly as evidence of the impacts of these climate extremes and affecting and population movements are becoming clearer. So what is climate mobility? Well, the unfortunate reality right now is there is no consensus definition on climate mobility across the region, or frankly, globally. We're seeing multiple terms being used. What generally is accepted is that it includes 3 categories of population. And I think it's important that we're clear on the categories we use, because this can create some tensions and challenges when thinking about solutions. We have populations that are displaced involuntarily from hazards, such as storms and floods. We have people who migrate, who are generally moving voluntarily due to stresses, sustained stresses, such as heat and sea level rise. And then we have what's called planned relocation, which are essentially controlled movements of people before, during, or after shocks and stress. There's also a growing appreciation in the literature, but also I think in policy circles, about the incredible complexity of climate mobility. We often tend to simplify to tell stories, but the reality is that this is a highly complex and often non-linear process. There are many factors that shape a person's decision as to whether they will move or not, including their own vulnerability, their own socioeconomic conditions, their own networks, and their own relationships across diasporas. In fact, there are regularly situations where people who you might otherwise expect would move simply cannot. They're trapped in place precisely because they lack the social and economic resources to move. What we do know, statistically speaking, and again, treating all statistics with a degree of caution, is that the scope and scale of climate mobility is worrying. An estimated 2 million people were on the move and displaced as a result of climate across the region, either temporarily or permanently last year, from storm floods, from landslides, and related shocks. Another 9 to 17 million people are believed to be at risk of migration in the coming decades owing to rising heat, to drought, and sea level rise. The combination of rising temperatures and rainfall in agriculturally dependent areas are expected to be quite acute. And a key point that I want to stress here is that the vast majority of these populations, the vast majority of mobility is expected to be internal rather than cross-border. So what we're talking about here is rural-to-rural movements and inter and intra-urban movements. But the reality as well is that we still lack sufficient data, good quality information, allowing us with a high level of granularity and precision to know where people are moving and to promote more orderly, safer, more dignified mobility for those who are on the move. So we're seeing right now, and this is the work we're doing with UNDP, is growing investment in modeling and predicting and forecasting mobility. To date, we've had fairly limited quantitative evidence. Most research that is relatively quantitative has drawn on economics. using historical data to predict future trends. But more recently, we're seeing a new generation of approaches, leveraging machine learning and spatial analytics. And they're showing real promise in looking at some of these direct and indirect correlations between climate change and mobility. Despite great improvements, though, we need to be quite cautious about our estimations and our research. There's still a high level of uncertainty and unpredictability. But growing research is validating a number of assumptions. The first is that, and this is important as we think about how we respond. The first is that, as already mentioned, most climate mobility is going to be internal rather than cross-border. The second is that densely populated areas are likely to be most implicated by out and in migration, especially in low-lying coastal areas. Third, it's not just the shocks and stresses, but it's the underlying socioeconomic vulnerabilities and institutional preparedness that really matters here. Fourth, we're going to see so-called hotspots emerging, but these are going to change over time. And our awareness will improve as the data analytics improve. What this means is we need to build uncertainty in our models, but we also need to get a lot better, and this was made earlier, a point earlier by earlier panelists, to explain these issues to public. Finally, we need to be very careful about overly bold and big numbers. They draw attention to the issue, of course, but we need to have more nuance in our understanding of cause and effect relationships. So we've come up with a framework to think about how to start mapping and modeling climate mobility hotspots. And it doesn't just focus on the risks and shocks and stresses associated with climate change. It also accommodates issues around socioeconomic drivers, especially drivers that seem to be highly correlated with climate mobility, declining crop yields, increased water stress, food insecurity. And then we look at underlying structural vulnerabilities, including levels of income, education, institutional readiness to be able to manage these issues. And we model these three factors against future climate and development scenarios, as well as historical trends and patterns in mobility. There are, of course, many data sources that are now coming online that are available, against which we can start getting and developing more effective and precise forecasts. So some fascinating analytics are being developed, and this is one by IOM. And as you can see here, what we're seeing is the distribution of climate vulnerability in relation to areas, crop areas that are exposed to shocks and stresses. And we're seeing that there's fairly even distribution globally, but we're also seeing the ways in which it's highly concentrated. Here's another slide that shows where crop areas are going to be affected, but where populations will also simultaneously mostly be affected. And not surprisingly, Latin America, which has some areas in Mexico and parts of northern and eastern Brazil affected, but the areas with the highest concentration globally, say in parts of South Asia, are where we're seeing potentially the most acute effects in the coming years. What we see here is areas where populations are going to be affected by drought. Again, in terms of the climate shocks and stresses in relation to hotspots for drought. And again, we see high concentrations in parts of northern Chile, in the central South America, in northeastern Brazil, as well as in parts of eastern Mexico. And again, when it comes to the populations that are going to be affected specifically, not surprisingly, when it comes to drought, we're also seeing populations in those same countries also potentially exposed. The World Bank has also developed some studies called under the rubric of groundswell, which have attempted to look at the ways in which different areas around Latin America and the Caribbean are going to be affected by out and in mobility due to climate shocks and stresses. They've actually leveraged those first generation tools using primarily economics in order to be able to develop regressions and also develop high resolution analysis of the ways in which different risks are manifest at the urban and peri-urban scale. These kinds of assessments that allow us to look at areas both of out mobility and in mobility are going to become invaluable for governments and civil society groups to support adaptation and resilience in advance. So in my remaining minute, let me underline just a few quick messages. It is a gloomy picture, but I think there are some silver linings right now, which is that we're seeing a global and expanding engagement with issues of climate mobility. We're seeing the issue, of course, being taken up by the UNFCCC, but we're also seeing it developed and being adapted into UN organizational plans. But even more importantly, we're seeing discrete and specific regional and global initiatives being established. This is just a small sample to try to promote better adaptation and resilience for people on the move, including those on the move due to climate shocks and stresses. We're also seeing growing regional and national attention. As part of our review with UNDP, we assessed different forms and ways in which national adaptation plans, or NAPs, and nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, are accounting for the issue of climate mobility. And what we're seeing is that virtually all NDCs across LAC at least make some acknowledgement of the issue, though we're not seeing as much progress in the case of national adaptation plans, where we need to see much more comprehensive engagement with strategies to support people on the move. More emphasis is needed on adaptation, because after all, climate mobility is a form of adaptation, and resilience promotion to be able to welcome populations that are on the move, to support people with training and skills and livelihood assistance before, during, and after they move. There's also growing evidence of policies, national and subnational policies across the region, from which I think we can learn extraordinary lessons to recognize the phenomena of climate mobility. Colombia in particular, but also Peru and Chile, are creating and have created tailored legislation to support, protect, and assist and promote adaptation for people on the move. Argentina is expanding protection and assistance. And I'll close here by simply saying there are a couple of basic principles that we're seeing for climate mobility, which I think I want to leave with you. Which one is to shift from seeing climate mobility not as a threat or a problem to be solved, but rather as a set of processes in which adaptation and resilience must be supported. The second point I want to leave you with is that climate mobility is often a fundamental coping strategy in the face of adversity, and people have to be assisted with dignity. So participatory approaches and consultative mechanisms are absolutely critical. Third is that climate mobility solutions must support people to move. So we need a process here to help manage their adaptation while they're on the move to reduce loss and damage, but also to stay, which means supporting community resilience in areas of reception. And this is going to depend on forward-looking analysis, really robust and multi-stakeholder partnerships, and much more inclusive processes that are currently in place. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Robert. It was quite intense, a lot of information, and we will get back to you. I was happy to see reference to Cuba and Grenada coming from a Caribbean small island region. Because when you begin to talk about migration, inward migration, certainly for us in the Caribbean, the issue of outward migration and how that trickles and impacts the local economy and basically overall economic recovery. So food for thought, and please keep your questions. I want to move on now to Joyce. Joyce, I have two questions. What, in terms of children and the youth's role in livelihood protection, and what can decision makers do to unblock youth potential to support the identification and implementation of solutions to livelihood protection? Joyce, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Bueno, I don't know which language I should speak, probably English, although my presentation is in Spanish, perhaps to be kind of more inclusive. So, okay, I'm gonna share my screen. I'm from my phone actually, so I'm gonna try to keep my video on. If not, I'm just here. I'm just gonna share the presentation. Just give me a sec. Just let me know if you can probably see my screen, please. Is it visible? Can you see it? Hello?
Go ahead.
Right.
Hi, hello. We can hear you. Yeah, good.
But
Sorry.
can you see my screen, right?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
Tracy, you're gonna have to help me, sorry. Because it is coming through a bit muffled for me. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna start because I gotta also leave very soon. Okay, perfect. So I just want to speak a little bit about kind of what we have done in my city, which is Foz de Iguaçu. So I was born in Colombia, but I was raised here in the triple border of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. It is a region where we call it a Terra das Águas, or the land of water, because we have several rivers, like the Iguaçu River that sets border with Paraguay and Brazil, Argentina and Brazil, and the Paraná River setting the border with Paraguay and Brazil. There is a lot of hydro potential. We have the Guarani Aquifer, which is another transboundary water reservoir shared with Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. However, we're being as it was mentioned before as well, in South America, especially in the heart of Mercosur, a lot impacts regarding the increase of temperature and as well the water crisis. Last let's call it winter or autumn, we had temperatures over 42 Celsius degrees, reaching the north of Paraguay, 50 Celsius, which is a normal the last 40 years. There's been a lot increase of temperatures. And this city, especially Foz do Iguaçu, is a region where we have a lot migrants, especially youth migrating to study in Brazil to look for other opportunities. But there is also a lot refugees and a lot of as well different communities in the city. And the question that I ask myself as well as a teenager is, okay, what is the relationship with migrants as a migrant as well? How, as we see, we were as well finding a new place like Foz do Iguaçu. However, climate change doesn't have borders, right? And it was setting a lot of challenges in the region. So how we can embrace this diversity in order to create public policies and as well transformation in our territories. So in the Brazilian legislation, we have something that is called Coletivo Educador, which are organizations set to bring several sectors, private, public sector, and to create data as well, and to work with a local government. So what we did is that we got a group with the Coletivo Educador, and they are one of the organizations I co-founded, the Observatorio Educador Ambiental Moema Vieser, which is an organization compound, which is like is part of the UNILA, of the Latin American Federal University for Integration. So we have a lot of youth multiculturality from several countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And the idea was to understand as well how we can change and promote information and policy change in our region, but as well through youth participation, through research, and through as well catalyzing the action. So we started a project actually that it was called the Triple Border of the Triangle City region with the support of the University of Leeds. We got to analyze the climate vulnerability in the border. Again, as climate change and climate adaptation goes beyond borders, we wanted to analyze the strategies, the strengths, but also the weaknesses we were having as a region, and how to create formal cooperation frameworks between the Argentinian, the Paraguayan, and the Brazilian city in the border, and how to also move from groups on WhatsApp to also kind of having information data. And we got to create a 3 national council on climate adaptation as well for emergencies. So here is the vulnerability assessment. I think we have it in 3 languages available. And it will be very interesting if you can also read it and to understand as well how to, as well as migrants, we were bringing as well a proposal and a public policy as well on adaptation. But one of the main results that we got, it was, okay, so to get to adaptation, we need full literacy and alphabetization process. So we ended up in several consultations, as it was mentioned before. Participation methodologies are fundamental. So we focus on creating the local policy on environmental education. So we were actually having several processes gathering the community to have what is the vision of the future that we want to reach through participatory methodologies, creating a study group to do the full writing of the law, and also doing a lobby to get our law approved actually by the local government. So again, youth, we were the main actors, especially migrant youth were very empowered. We were reaching the community, getting the data, getting the information. As well, we were opening to other platforms, doing a survey online, and as well we were trying to reach people in several languages, as our region is a very multicultural one. So we were reaching in Portuguese, in Spanish, and in Guarani as well, which is the native language we speak in the region. And also, one of the participatory methodologies that it was very disruptive and amazing that we got to use is the social cartography. So social cartography allows us to get information that we will not find in a Google Maps or necessarily on the internet. So we got to divide, this is the map of our city of Foz do Iguaçu. We divided in 6 main basins where we have all the neighborhoods actually in
36 micro basins. So we were holding several workshops with the community to get this information about what are the good practices, right? What are actually the issues as well that we have in the region. So people were designing on the map and they were telling us, oh, it used to be a river here, or we used to have this. And so we were also creating the history of our community. And also we were understanding what were the needs in order to have this as an input for the local policy on environmental education. We got a lot of support from different communities, from the local government, and we got to create a book actually explaining a little bit about our process. But furthermore, to have a policy and to get information to improve livelihood conditions, we also wanted to create a network of participation, of support among the community. So again, youth were participating, several groups of faith, several we have a lot of diversity, and we got to create actually something that's called encontros y caminos, or it was like a way to meet, but also to create the roadmap ahead of what we wanted to do as well with our community. And then we realized we were identifying that the main challenge as well, especially for climate, not just adaptation, but also let's say mitigation, it was to protect our forest. So again, this is a QR code from the book. It's in Portuguese. We're thinking perhaps to translate in other languages to explain how simple but powerful is the methodology. And also how youth were the catalyst of transformation of the whole process. But then again, we were experiencing a very difficult time as well in Brazil during the past government. And I don't know if you have heard about the Iguazu Falls. They are massive, amazing falls. They are protected by UNESCO, by the park, which they are located at, the Atlantic Forest or the National Park of Iguazu. In the Argentinian side is protected, but it wasn't in the Brazilian side. So we decided as community to actually connect the forest of our community with national legislation. So we were using, again, social cartography. We brought experts as well from Brasilia, for very important parts of Brazil, to create this with the park rangers, with the communities. So we are in the process. Actually, the last 3 days have been very intense because I've been there and here online. So we are actually doing a follow-up on how to do a proper mapping of the municipal plan of the Atlantic Forest. The Atlantic Forest is a very fundamental forest, besides as well the Amazon for the south of Brazil and in the Mercosur area. So we do proper consultations, and we are in the process of drafting as well the local law of protection of the forest, of the Atlantic Forest. And as well, another very important thing is that we got as well to explain and to bring our case as part of the regional declaration of the Regional Conference on Youth. So it's a very important as well document, not just for policymakers, but also for youth, for everybody who wants to take a look of real examples, tangible examples. And I also would like to say that what we also got to do is to prevent as well a massive deforestation, because there was a proposal to build actually an avenue to connect many cities for the agribusiness in the region, because we struggle, like our region produces a lot, meat, soy, rice, and we could not protest during that time due to the repression that we have in the previous Brazilian government, but we got to do public policy, and we got to protect this as well with the community. So pretty much this is what I wanted to share with you. It's been such a intense work, but we are very excited as well to bring these two international frameworks and to explain as well that adaptation, yes, you need a knowledge as well, but it is related as well, not just with the present, but with the future of peoples, and everybody can be part of it. Like we had very young people as well. So yeah, just I'm very excited to be here, and then I could share as well the links on the chat, and I really encourage you to use social participatory methodologies. They are brilliant and they are very inclusive, and also, as it was mentioned before, interculturality, multiculturality, the dialogue among cultures is fundamental for us to tackle the climate crisis. Muito obrigada, Aguijevete, and thank you very much in Guarani.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move to Mabel, who's here with us. And so my questions, Mabel, is why is it important to incorporate considerations of people's livelihoods in the formulation of adaptation policies and measures? And you would have just heard Joyce's how, again, to bring that bottom-up inclusive approach to local, vulnerability assessments, mapping, and planning. So perhaps you could also reflect as well. And then last is, why is it important that inclusive participatory mechanisms are put in place to design those adaptation actions? And again, I could see you potentially bridging what she was saying with what you're about to say. So the floor is yours, Mabel.
Hola, muy buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias. Un gusto poder estar acompañándoles.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to do my presentation in Spanish. And I believe it's really important to be coming right after Joyce, because a lot of the things she mentioned is the approach that we have from Panama for adaptation projects. Next slide, please. In a general overview, we all know from the previous panelists how has climate change affected people's livelihoods. I like to mention that the climate change has the face of people because it affects their lives in topics of agriculture, food security, health, infrastructure, soils, changes in the marine coastal areas. And this is a more pressing topic in Panama. There's a lot of climate migration, climate-induced migration, and so this affects the livelihood of people because of climate change. Then there's the importance of linking the livelihood with what we're going to do to adaptation to climate change. We cannot think in adaptation as something that we're going to impose to communities. We have to co-design it with them, and definitely we have to take into account their idiosyncrasy, their culture, their economic, social activities they have in the communities, the physiological characteristics, geological characteristics of the area. So we have to engage ourselves straight up with the communities and generating economic resiliency, because oftentimes these adaptation measures require a change in the economic activities of the community. And if that happens, how can we ensure that that change is truly resilient in the short, mid, and long term, so that it wouldn't happen again, another catastrophe, and then we have to change the economic activity one more time. Again, conservation of local knowledge. There's a lot of local knowledge in our communities, and we have to work with that and understand the importance of incorporating this knowledge in the strategies. The active participation in the communities throughout the process, and also innovation, not only methodologies, but the way we work, the way we communicate, the way we encounter ourselves. What Joyce was mentioning before, these are approaches or strategies that we have incorporated, taking into consideration when we go to the communities to bring the projects. First of all, to foster education and technical capacities and political and local capacities in terms of adaptation, to enable the access to resources. Sometimes the projects or the measures we design for the projects require an investment and capital seed, and it's important to define which is the capital seed we need to create support networks, establishing associations of experts. How can we link each other in the topics of training and education too? I'm going to give you an example of some projects in Panama that we have linked this process of community participation, also taking into consideration the livelihoods of communities. These proposals is still a proposal. One is being currently executed, and the other one is finishing with the concept note to be presented to the Green Fund. This is one that we are finishing the concept note, this is a project we intend to develop in the western side of Panama. We call it a province. In other countries, it would be a region. And the main idea is to improve resiliency or increase resiliency through an adaptation focused on this is interinstitutional project. Many different public institutions are going to be working for the development of the project. We have a good engagement with the Minister of Economy and Finance, and they are developing the financial economic component, how we're going to transform people's livelihoods. So we have kept to agro, forest, and cattle areas, a seed fund, try to protect the watershed, capturing and processing rainwater, and also clean energy through photovoltaic cells. This is environmental change, climate change. You create the This was published in 2021, and we were able to find communities that have a high index of vulnerability for climate change. We're going to be working in Panama Oeste in the Capira area, one of the most vulnerable areas, and it also has social economic vulnerabilities. This is a beehive community. Three projects are with high vulnerability communities, prioritized through the vulnerability index, the work that we intend to do. Second project, currently under execution, we have moved forward through the cooperation of the European Union, through the Europlus and the Spanish Cooperation Agency. And this project is being developed in an indigenous population called the Special Reservation Nove Buglé, Comarca. And this project is our flagship because this is to do everything, the vulnerability assessment of the community, to establish then an adaptation plan with an approach of territory order. But we need a big engagement with the community. This is a remote access. You have to take river mobilization, and it takes a lot of logistical expenses and transportation expenses, but we have a technician who is working over there in the community. The community work, the linking work with the communities, with them. We had a cacao production in a sustainable way project. I'm trying to do this transformation, how to produce within the community space. So we had this approach, and they have participated, and they have mentioned their main vulnerabilities and problems, and understanding that this is an issue of government responsibility. Basic services like education, health are missing in the community, and this adds up to climate vulnerability. The work we have done with the communities has been really important, and we have had this vision within the project that requires seed capital to implement adaptation measures in the community. The main idea is to improve the livelihood. And the last project we have that I'm going to present to you actually within the framework of livelihood and in importance is the Cardisustud community. This is the first climate displaced community. This is indigenous people from the Gunayala region, the Subtub community, because of sea level increases for about 13 years now. It became a reality to the community. It's the first displaced community. They were displaced from their native island into terra firme. This was we had a panel at the beginning of the week on this issue, and it was interesting to listen to some people from the community. So when they moved into farmland, their livelihoods changed because they were depending too much on fishing, and now they are farther away from the coast as opposed to living right there on the island. So we're looking for financing to strengthen technical knowledge and to generate new activities in the community. There are livelihoods that will continue to exist, but we need to generate new ideas so that the community has a sustainable income. The person from the community in the panel mentioned they have new concerns, for example, the cost of energy, the cost of clean water that they didn't have to pay for before in their community. But in this new location, in land, they have to take care of it. They need to generate new knowledge and strengthen. With these three examples, what I wanted to let you know today is that the adaptation projects require community participation and also require that we take into account the livelihood of the communities. If we're going to generate a change in the way that they carry their work, their culture, their idiosyncrasy, we have to take into account how those changes could change their livelihood and the way they live in their surroundings. We cannot generate solutions just on paper. We have to go to the field, include them, let them participate. They have a lot to say. We can co-design with them these strategies that we need to enact. Thank you.
Yes, we actually have to say goodbye, but I'm going to beg the indulgence of the organizers. I'm going to ask Priyanka to give 30 seconds to 1 minute reflections on what she's heard, and even opportunities of how we can move forward from here. So Priyanka, it's yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists for your remarks. I think one thing that definitely stood out to me was the statement, don't only look at the climate crisis or climate change as a threat, but also as an opportunity to reimagine and adapt for a more sustainable global community. And I think this is especially important from a youth perspective because it can be implemented in how we move forward in transforming our education systems and ensuring that our education systems ensure quality climate education and redefine how we teach climate change and how we teach how we can adapt and mitigate to the crisis. And it will create opportunities for content where it's climate change based books for children or climate TV shows or curriculums within the school curriculum, and how our children will be exposed to this information. And I think, as you mentioned, on a community level as well, ensuring that the people who are most affected have the access to the information that the policymakers and the statistics that they do have. And this will ensure that the livelihoods are also regenerative and sustainable as we move forward, and ensuring that everyone has access to quality climate information, and that gap is closed in how we move forward and how we plan to develop as a region. Thank you.
I want to leave a point for Robert. You've heard diversity in terms of perspectives, regions, and I know the modeling work. As you said, it's data driven. There are lots of assumptions, but how to localize what you see and hear through this forum into your modeling. I think it brings a real world perspective of what we're dealing with. And again, asking as you build out your frameworks that you do try to localize products and services, how things can get into schools, etc. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank all of you. This has been a very rich discussion. I think you have to, Tracy, you have to find perhaps 2 sessions, probably break these up in the future. There's a lot to discuss here. So again, I want you to give a round of applause to our panelists, for those here and online. So this brings our session to an end, and we would also like to thank Save the Children, UN Women, UNICEF, UNDP, UNEP, UNFCCC, and the World Bank for this joint effort. Again, thank you. I am out. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Robert, thank you very much for that information. I think